Deep in the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River holds secrets that have never been revealed, including what happened to a young couple who vanished without a trace in 1928. In this episode, I'm going to take you through a case that has spawned nearly a century of theories, false confessions, and a shocking secret that is probably the largest in the Grand Canyon history. I'm Josh Ninocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. Early on the morning of October 20th, 1928, a 28-year-old man named Glen Hyde was standing on the banks of Utah's Green River, and he was watching his new wife, Bessie, carefully load the last of their supplies into their homemade boat. You see, Glen had spent weeks building this vessel, a 20-foot sweep scow that people had taken to calling a floating coffin behind his back. But he didn't care what they thought. He was about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime with the woman he loved, and nothing was going to stop him. Bessie, who was just 21, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she double-checked their provisions. They had enough food for several weeks at this point, camping gear, and even a set of bed springs. The first time anyone had ever carried a full bed down the river. And as she worked, she was just so excited and nervous about the adventure to come. And in just a few hours, she would begin a journey that would make her the first woman in history to successfully run the rapids of the Colorado River. Well, that was the plan. What neither Glen nor Bessie knew as they pushed off from the shore that morning is that things wouldn't go as planned. But to understand what happened to them, we need to go all the way back. Glen Roland Hyde was actually from Twin Falls, Idaho, and had grown up around rivers. His father had taught him to navigate the Snake and Salmon rivers when he was just a boy, and by the time he was in his 20s, he considered himself something of an expert when it came to whitewater rafting. He was tall and angular with a confidence that some people found charming and others off-putting. When he set his mind to something, nothing could dissuade him. Bessie, on the other hand, had grown up far from any rivers in Parkersburg, West Virginia. She was petite and delicate looking with fine features that made her appear even younger than her 21 years. But even despite her appearance, there was a strength in her that most people didn't see at first glance. And the two had met in early 1927 on a ship while traveling from San Francisco to Los Angeles because Bessie had booked a one-way ticket with a friend, fleeing her crumbling marriage to a man named Earl Helmick. She had no intention of ever returning to her old life, and then somehow, maybe it was in the stars, she met Glen. And from the moment they started speaking, there was just an undeniable spark between them. Glen was charming and adventurous and full of stories about his outdoor exploits, and of course, Bessie was captivated. And Glen, for his part, was smitten with this beautiful young woman who seemed so eager to embrace new experiences. But there was a problem. Bessie was still married, but that didn't stop them, nor does it really stop anyone nowadays. Now, after the ship had docked in LA, Glen convinced her to come with him to Idaho. He wanted to show her his world, to share with her the outdoor life he loved so much. And so Bessie, throwing caution to the wind, agreed. Of course, Glen's family welcomed her, and they took her on a camping trip to Redfish Lake, and it was there, surrounded by the pines and the water, that something just awakened within her. Because she had never experienced anything like this before. I mean, the freedom, the beauty, the possibility that came with being in the wilderness. I mean, she was hooked. And so what happened is at the end of summer, she knew what she had to do. She took Glen back to West Virginia to meet her family and to formally end her marriage to Earl. Her family was, of course, shocked. I mean, how could she just leave her husband for the stranger? Even though Glen and Earl ended up physically duking it out, Bessie had made up her mind. She was going to be with Glen no matter what anyone said. And so after returning west with Glen, she finally served Earl his papers. The proceedings dragged on for months, but finally, in April of 1928, the divorce was finalized. Now, the very next day, Glen and Bessie were married in a simple ceremony. They then moved to Glen's farm in Idaho, ready to start their new life together. But almost instantly, they realized there was a problem. Life on the farm was boring. Day after day, it was just the same routine, feeding animals, tending the crops, fixing fences. Glen and Bessie were adventurers at heart. This mundane lifestyle, this boring existence was just driving them mad. They needed something dangerous, something more. They needed an adventure. And Glen had this idea. They hadn't taken a proper honeymoon at this point. And he's like, you know what? I know exactly what we should do. They should go whitewater rafting down the Colorado River, all the way through the Grand Canyon. It would be dangerous, of course, but Glen was so confident in his abilities. I mean, if they succeeded, Bessie would, of course, make history as the first woman to navigate these rapids. Bessie, of course, was really nervous about the idea because she had only been camping a handful of times up to this point, but Glen kept reassuring her that he would teach her everything she needed to know, she'll be okay, and with him as her guide, she would be safe. And after bringing in the harvest in the fall of 1928, they decided it was final. They were going to do it. They packed up their things, they headed to Green River in Utah, and Glen immediately set to work building their boat. He decided on a sweep scow design, which is similar to boats he had used on Idaho rivers. This was a flat-bottomed vessel, roughly 20 feet long and 5 feet wide, and with one long sweep oars at each end for steering. And as he worked on the boat, hammering boards and sealing joints, people in the area would occasionally wander by to see what he was doing. In fact, there were 2 experienced river runners who took one look at Glen's creation and just shook their heads. I mean, they're just thinking, that's a floating coffin, they're gonna die. And they told Glen to his face that, you know, the Green River isn't like it was back in Idaho. I mean, this was dangerously low, and the boat he was designing was not suited for Colorado's rapids, or at least wait until the conditions were better. But Glen was so confident in his ability that he didn't take heed. He's like, you know what? I'm not going to take advice from strangers. I got this. I know what I'm doing. Usually, the river had a way of humbling people, but sometimes it did worse. But of course, Glen wasn't thinking about any of that as he was putting the finishing touches on his boat. All he could think about was this incredible adventure ahead. In addition, the chance at immortality, because, I mean, not in a literal sense, but if they could set a speed record running the Colorado River, their names would go down in history. They would be famous. On the morning of October 20th, with their boat loaded and ready, Glen and Bessie pushed off from shore and began their journey. The first few days went smoothly, right? They just got to enjoy each other's company. It was perfect weather. It was a calm river, and they just had a great time enjoying each other's company and cruising along. 4 days into the trip have gone by at this point, and Glen managed to shoot a duck, and that night they feasted on fresh meat and potatoes they had brought from Idaho. And on that night, as they sat by their campfire just watching the stars and the darkening sky, Bessie was so content. And she realized for the first time that this is what life was supposed to be like. Adventure, fresh air, freedom, just her and Glen, her partner in crime, against the world. Now, things went great over the following couple weeks. They continued down the river. They were very successful in navigating these increasingly difficult rapids, and it's no surprise that Glen's prior experience proved him to be an excellent captain, reading the water with an expertise that impressed Bessie. When they made it through Cataract Canyon, also known as the graveyard of the Colorado for all the boats it had claimed, she felt pride because they were really doing this and they were killing it. Now, on November 1st, they stopped again to carve their names into the rock. Hyde 11-128. They were making great time, and Glen was already calculating in his head how their pace compared to previous speed records. I mean, at this point, if they kept this up, they might actually see a new record. So after a brief rest at Lee's Ferry, they entered the Grand Canyon proper on November 12th. The canyon walls rose up around them, massive and imposing, making their little boat seem even smaller than it was. But Glen and Bessie weren't intimidated, because if anything, the grandeur of their surroundings only added to everything. During this time, they were able to send a few letters to their families. Bessie wrote to her parents just telling them how wonderful the trip was going and how capable Glen was as a navigator, how she couldn't wait to tell them all about it when they returned. Glen wrote to his father providing updates on their progress and boasting about the time they were making. Now, by November 15th, they had reached Bright Angel Creek, where they hiked up to Grand Canyon Village on the south rim to resupply. It was there that their adventure took an unexpected turn, though not the kind of turn that would end their journey. A reporter from the Denver Post happened to be at the village, and when he heard about the couple attempting to navigate the Colorado, with Bessie potentially becoming the first woman to do so, he immediately requested an interview. Glen, of course, never one to shy away from attention, eagerly agreed, and the resulting article was picked up by newspapers all across the country, including the New York Times. Suddenly, Glen and Bessie Hyde were national news. They were big deals, because people from coast to coast were following their journey, rooting for them to succeed. Bessie was being hailed as a pioneer, a brave woman challenging the male-dominated world of river running. And while they were enjoying all their fame, they prepared to leave Grand Canyon Village and continue on their journey. He was already imagining the reception they would receive when they completed their trip. There would be interviews, maybe even a book deal. They would be celebrities. He couldn't wait. So on November 18th, they reached Hermit Camp, where they stopped to rest and were photographed by another traveler. Later that day, they pushed off from Hermit Camp and headed into the Hermit Rapid. Now, according to Brad Dimmock, who would later write the definitive book on their disappearance, they blasted through the waves and slipped downstream into the Black Schist Gorge. The late November weather was turning colder and darkness came earlier each day. And then there was nothing. There was no more letters or anything. There was no updates. They had just simply vanished. People weren't initially worried because the couple had told people that they were expecting to reach Needles, California by early December, and here we are still in November. They were probably just making their way through the canyon out of contact with civilization. That was normal for a river trip. But as it came into December and there was no word, people began to grow concerned. Glen's father, Roland, was the first to sound the alarm. He knew his son was an experienced outdoorsman, but he also knew the Colorado River was very dangerous. So when December 5th came and went with no sign of Glen and Bessie, he sprang into action. He immediately traveled to Las Vegas and began petitioning every authority he could think of. He started with local officials, but when they seemed slow to act, he just kept going higher and higher up. He sent telegrams, he made phone calls, and refused to take no for an answer. His son and daughter-in-law were missing, and by God, someone was going to do something about it. His persistence paid off, though, because on December 17th, Dwight Davis, the United States Secretary of War, ordered an aerial search of the Colorado River to be conducted by Army personnel from San Francisco. At the same time, Roland put up a $1,000 reward, which at the time is a substantial sum for any information leading to their whereabouts. Within days, the search was in full swing. Planes flew over the canyon looking for any sign of the couple or their boat. Search parties on foot combed the riverbanks, and you had experienced river runners launching boats to search the water itself. On December 19th, there was a break. One of the planes spotted what looked like a boat floating in calm water about 237 miles down the river. The pilot couldn't be certain from the air, but it appeared to be the same boat and intact. And so when his father had heard, of course his heart leapt. If the boat was intact and floating, that meant that they hadn't capsized, that maybe they had just lost the boat somehow and were waiting on shore for rescue. Even though a rescue party was quickly organized and was made up of very experienced river runners who knew the area very well, it still took them days to reach the location where the boat had been spotted. They had to battle through rapids and very difficult terrain, and in some places, the water level had dropped so low that they had to carry their boats over land. Well, fast forward to Christmas morning, they reached Glen and Bessie's boat. What they found was deeply unsettling. The boat was floating in a calm pool about 30 feet from the shore. Very still, very quiet, and as they got close, they could see that the sweep oars were still in place, trailing in the water as if Glen and Bessie had just stepped away for a moment. When they climbed aboard, all their gear was neatly stowed. Glen's rifle was there in the corner, their food supplies were largely intact, and on the gunwale of the boat, they found a series of notches, 42 in total, with a cross marked for each Sunday. The notches told them that Glen and Bessie had been keeping careful track of their journey, that they had left Hermit Camp on day 30, which meant they hadn't made it another 12 days before what? They searched thoroughly, looking for any signs or answers or any clue as to what had happened, and they found Bessie's journal and camera, both potentially valuable sources of info, but they found no sign of violence or blood or any indication that there was some sort of struggle. Even more puzzling is that they found Glen and Bessie's warm coats and boots still in the boat. So then the question is, why would they have left without them, especially in this weather? The boat itself was slightly damaged, but nothing too bad. I mean, it was still floating, still very serviceable, and it was evident now more than ever that whatever had happened to these two, it hadn't been a simple capsizing. As the rescuers stood there, looking out in the canyon walls, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. It was as if Glen and Bessie had simply disappeared and left everything behind. So all they could do was just gather the evidence they had found and headed back to civilization. And when they finally got back, they delivered all the news to Roland. And as you can imagine, he was pretty anxious about the news. The journal and camera, everyone hoped would provide answers, but when they were closely examined, it's only deepened the mystery. The thing is, Bessie's journal entries were fragmentary and sometimes cryptic. She mentioned not feeling well at one point, and that led to some speculation that she might have been pregnant. On November 23rd, she wrote about Glen spending all night trying to free their boat after it got caught on some rocks. That must have been what damaged the boat. Most intriguingly, on November 25th, Bessie had begun using a code in her journal. She started using dashes to indicate calm water, vertical slashes for rapids, and circles for rifles. And then the last few pages were full of these symbols, showing that they had been navigating increasingly difficult water. But the code wasn't entirely clear, and some symbols, like a plus sign that appeared near the end, remained a mystery. The last photographs on the camera showed that they had reached river mile 226, while her journal indicated they had cleared mile 231, and the boat had been found at mile 237. So they'd only traveled an additional 6 miles, but what happened? Search teams continued to scour through the area, but there was no trace of either of them ever found. Now, eventually, Roland had to admit defeat. His son and daughter-in-law were presumed dead, and there was nothing he could do about it. He just had to accept the circumstances. But folks, we all know that a good mystery doesn't end there, and that's far from it. In fact, this was just the start. You see, over the years, there's been theories emerging about what had happened to Glen and Bessie, and I'm sure many of you watching this are very familiar with them. The simplest explanation was that they had drowned. Perhaps they had both left the boat to bathe or explore and been swept away by the current. But of course, this is unlikely, because Glen was too experienced to make such basic mistakes. And why would they have both left the boat at the same time? Others suggested that they staged a disappearance, but this made even less sense. They'd been on the verge of completing a historic journey that would have made them famous. I mean, it doesn't make sense for them to throw that potential fame away, especially how much work they were putting into making this happen. Well, fast forward to 1976, and a skeleton was discovered on the rim of the Grand Canyon with a bullet hole in the skull. For a very brief time, people wondered if this might be Glen, and he was somehow murdered by someone who had then abducted Bessie. But after deep forensic analysis, the skeleton actually belonged to somebody much younger than Glen. And the remains, of course, were from the 1970s, not the 20s, but the most intriguing theory emerged in 1971 during a river rafting expedition led by a guide named Rick Petrillo. Among the rafters was an older woman named Liz Cutler, described as very thin, wiry, hardy, and pretty gung-ho. And despite her age, she was very skilled with handling rapids. And one night, the group was sitting around the campfire, telling stories, and Rick was sharing some of the famous tales of the river and inevitably the story of Glen and Bessie. And he told the group how the couple had, of course, vanished and how their boat had been found abandoned and no one really knew what had happened to them. And Liz decided to speak up and explain her side of the story. And this is where the twist comes in. She flat out dropped a bombshell and just told them, look, I know the story, I've heard it before, I'm Bessie Hyde. And she went on to explain that she killed Glen. Apparently, the story goes that her and Glen had gotten into a terrible fight somewhere along the river, and he had actually beaten her badly. And that night, while he slept, she had stabbed him, and then she drug his body to the river and just let the current take it. And then abandoned the boat, walked downstream to Diamond Creek, where she knew there was a way out of the canyon. From there, she had made her way to Peach Springs, caught a Greyhound bus, back east, leaving her old life and her old name behind forever. No one knew whether she was actually telling the truth or not, but the details were disturbingly specific. But if she was telling the truth, it would explain the detail from the scene. Why Glen's body was never found while the boat was intact. And, you might think the story ended there, right? Just some sort of campfire tale, whatever. It's all speculation. But more has developed. In 1992, a famous river runner named Georgie Clark passed away at 81. Well, Georgie was a legend in the whitewater community. She was the first woman to commercially run the Grand Canyon, had pioneered new rafting techniques, and had spent decades on the Colorado River. She was a tough, independent, and notably secretive person, at least about her past. And when Georgie died, her colleague Bill George was asked to deliver her eulogy. He had also purchased her river running company to preserve her legacy. But the morning of the funeral, he received a strange phone call from Lee McCurry, who was the nurse that had been closest to Georgie in her final days. And they had a very interesting conversation. She's like, Bill, we don't know who we're burying today. And as you can imagine, Bill was very confused. And he's like, what do you mean? She's like, well, I need you to see me. So he met up with this person, and she handed him a stack of documents that were from Georgie that she had kept hidden. Among them was a birth certificate, but the name wasn't Georgie Clark. I think you guys know where this is going. It was Bessie DeRoss. And the birthplace wasn't Chicago, as Georgie had claimed, but Denver. Even stranger was that in her possession, there was a certified copy of Glen and Bessie's marriage certificate. Why would she have such a document? And why had she kept it hidden in a drawer along with a pistol? To make matters even stranger, this is a person who had refused to be in the same room as the river runners who had found Glen and Bessie's original abandoned boat. She would literally walk out when they entered. Additionally, she went on to give birth to a daughter in 1929, right around the time Bessie Hyde, who had written in her journal about not feeling well, might have been pregnant. So could Georgie Clark have actually been Bessie? Had she killed her husband, escaped the canyon, and created an entirely new identity for herself? Had she then spent the rest of her life on the very river where she had murdered her husband, becoming one of its most celebrated pioneers? But unfortunately, Georgie took her secrets to the grave. Her daughter had died in an accident years prior, and other family members just insisted that they had known Georgie all their lives. Now, of course, there is the skeptical side, which is, that Georgie and Bessie have very differing appearances, including eye color, along with other things. But the truth, it seemed, would never be known for certain. And this, folks, is easily the biggest secret of the Grand Canyon. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below floating coffin. So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy this kind of content, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.